I think some of the reaction towards working class Leave voters since the 23rd of June has been pretty appalling, to be honest. We've heard all of the old paternalistic arguments about, people didn't know what they were voting for, and even people questioning whether these people should be given the vote and older people shouldn't be given the vote and all of this sort of thing. And I have to say I've heard leaders in the trade union movement talk about the vote as a setback, and I think we just need to remind ourselves what people did on the 23rd of June. We had, for the first time in living memory, I think millions of ordinary working class voters who had been treated with contempt and ignored by an establishment which sneered at them and frankly didn't listen to their concerns. And people turned out on the 23rd of June and defeated that establishment. Working class people came together despite all the bullying and all the coercion and all the threats. They took on a Tory government, a Tory Prime Minister and Chancellor who have now gone. They took on the mainstream political parties who were supporting a Remain vote, the IMF, the CBI, big business, the banking industry, the US government, NATO. The entire establishment lined up and told working class people not to do this, and they did it. And they did it because they felt it was the only weapon they had left available to make their political masters sit up and take notice of them. And I think that in the labour and trade union movement, we should embrace that. We should applaud that. We should applaud the bravery that they showed on the 23rd of June by defeating that establishment. Not that it's a final victory by any stretch of the imagination. We're still faced with a Tory government at home who's intent on attacking ordinary workers, and of course we have to defend our rights. But at least we've given a kick to one of the pillars of austerity in Europe that has made people suffer, and I think given hope to other people who live in the EU that they could do it too. And instead of demonising people or criticising people for doing what they did on the 23rd of June, we should applaud the fact that it was a genuine democratic revolt, that working class England, which until now has always played second fiddle to middle England in the minds of the politicians, came together and said, actually, we're not having this anymore. And we need to harness that anger, we need to harness that mood, and turn it into something against the Tories. The last thing we should be doing on the left is criticising those people or describing it as a setback or suggesting in some way that what happened wasn't a good thing. It was. I think one thing that's become pretty clear post the 23rd of June is that the political and economic Armageddon that was predicted by some people in the Remain camp just has not happened. We were told there was going to be meltdown, we were told the economy was going to crash and burn, we were told there'd need to be an emergency budget and all the rest of it, an austerity budget, and none of that has taken place. And I think many of us realise that all of that was completely overblown in the first place. Now, there's been turbulence. Inevitably, when you make a seismic political decision like this, there's going to be some turbulence. People in the city and people in Europe have thrown their toys out of the pram a little bit, but I think as things settle down, and I think as wiser heads prevail, I think both the countries inside the EU and people in Britain will realise that actually a perfectly constructive and mutually beneficial relationship between the EU and the UK is possible. And within that, of course, we've got to defend workers' rights. Not that the EU was ever a great defender of working people's rights, contrary to what a lot of people on the left said at the time. That was never really the case. And I think all this talk, if countries inside the EU decide to whack tariffs on British imports, I think that would be absurd, because actually we've got a trade deficit with the EU and they sell to us more than we sell to them, so actually that would backfire on them. So I wouldn't particularly anticipate any silliness like that unless they do have some kind of death wish in terms of their own trade. And I think we should be optimistic about it. Just as people said we would never cope outside the single currency, and we did. In fact, we were better off for being outside it. I think the same applies to the EU, and we can continue to trade with countries inside the EU just as China does, just as the US does, just as Japan does. And you know, there's an internationalist future there as well. This argument that, you know, the international argument was carried by the Remain camp, I think was always nonsense. You know, I think we can become a global player and turn outwards to the world, and I think people on the left should embrace that.